There's no sense in fighting the sea. We must join forces with it. The problem of climate change goes hand in hand with rising sea levels. In the future, 75% of all people could be living along the coast. Already, today, atolls and islands in various parts of the world, in the Maldives and Polynesia, flood with the slightest storm.
Even in places where people were not used to flooding at all, it is becoming more and more a reality. Look at 2012, Hurricane Sandy, that hit also the city of New York. The water reached all the way to the heart of Manhattan for weeks. UN Habitat, we look at all possible solutions that can help us deal with climate change, and floating cities could be one of the potential innovative solutions.
As our world is now threatened by sea level rise, then we see that we have to find new space and safe space. And I think if your city is threatened by the water, then the best place to be is already on top of the water, because then you can move up and down with the fluctuations of the water. The technology is ready, costs are lower. Maybe we're the first ones that for which all the conditions are ready and on green to build these kind of structures.
Today, architects, urban planners and engineers are working on the blue revolution, something they consider to be the next step in human development. Could the construction of floating habitats be a solution to rising sea levels, an answer to the major challenge of our time? Or will floating cities prove to be nothing more than an experiment by tech billionaires seeking more autonomy than states are willing to give them?
I've been living on this houseboat for 40 years. I'm very happy here on the water because you behave differently. You somehow live in a different world on the water. After my time with Cousteau on the Calypso, I was lucky enough to build a few underwater houses. One, called Galete, is in Japan. Another, called Hippocampe, was built in collaboration with Comex, an underwater engineering company. And I lived in this underwater house. These are moments of happiness. Living on the water is becoming increasingly attractive. The idea of a floating city is not really new. Well, maybe the idea of a city is, but not of a village at least. It's a question of scale. Different peoples all over the world have fled to the sea for various cultural and military reasons, like the Bajau. The Urus on Lake Titicaca have retreated into the reeds. They use this local material to build floating islands on which they also construct their houses that float. They don't want to live anywhere else. They found a way of life that suits their culture, and they're completely adapted to this aquatic world.
But is the general population ready to consider living on water? According to Jacques Rougerie, we are more open to this idea than we used to be.
Our relationship with the sea has changed completely. A century ago, no one would have thought of swimming. But today you see a passion for the sea, the fascination it exerts. You look at the horizon, what is happening there in the distance. This fascination has always been there. At the same time, there was this fear of the monsters from the ocean that will devour you and your ship. A sailor who went overboard was a dead sailor. No one even tried to save him. In his work 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, Jules Verne predicted that the future of humanity lay precisely there. But he was thinking of a time 500 or 1,000 years in the future. And then suddenly Jacques Cousteau came along with his autonomous submersible, barely 60 years after Jules Verne. And he made these fantastic films and showed us that there are seasons down in the sea. Our perspective has changed. In 2050, which is not far off, 75% of people will want to live by the water. They'll want to go underwater, surf above the water, and so on. So it's a kind of return to our roots.
In the 1960s, visionary architect Buckminster Fuller designed Triton City, a floating city for up to 100,000 inhabitants.
Bucky is considered the Leonardo da Vinci of the 20th century, and he was thought that to be that even in the 1940s. He was seen as a Renaissance man. He was quite well known for the geodesic dome. He designed cars, he designed different kinds of shelter solutions.
Bucky was ahead of his times. He anticipated the fragility of the planet and saw many of the things that we take for granted today.
So he felt that we have so much real estate out there to design new approaches to building. It was all about modularity. You started out with a neighborhood that would be a small amount, 5,000 people. Then those would build into a town that was the next level higher. And then those would build into a city when they were all connected.
The concept of that city was the idea that a city, that a community could be autonomous, that it could process its own water, process its own waste, generate its own energy. In other words, it could be self-sufficient.
The core of the Triton City was powered, for the most part, by atomic power. The heat that was given off could help with desalination and all of the different kinds of renewable capabilities. You wouldn't think the grandfather of the ecology movement would care about atomic power as an option at that time. It was a combination of alternative energy that powered this city. Wind power, solar power, even tide power. And the ocean, Fuller thought, was not being utilized. I really believe that the reason that Triton wasn't made was because it was cost prohibitive at that time. So they did a feasibility study, but the materials were not ready for prime time. He was never working with the kinds of materials we have today.
Today, this dream of floating cities has made a comeback. How would they work? What would life there be like? Could they be a solution to the challenges of climate change? Engineer and researcher Rutger de Graaf advises local authorities and governments and is one of the co-founders of the Blue Revolution Foundation.
Blue Revolution for us is the next big shift of humanity where a substantial part of the human population on the planet will live underwater in a sustainable, ecologically friendly way in harmony with nature. I definitely think there's a big momentum today on floating cities and floating architecture. When we started 17 years ago, people still said, yeah, those are just a bunch of crazy Dutch engineers and, you know, these guys are completely out of their mind.
A few kilometres from here, internationally renowned architect and Blue Revolution pioneer Koen Althaus has been working on the concept of the floating city for over 2 decades.
I'm a city doctor. We see the city as a patient and we try to cure it with water. So water is our medicine. If you look at this work for the last 20 years, the 3 projects we did, we had the floating villa in Miami, which could push itself out of the water. Then we had, on the other end, projects in India for the poorest people in flood zones. And then we have the theater in Lyon. If we see our cities today, they are quite static. And the best thing to improve cities is to take use of the water space in the city. That's because of the space, but also of the safety and also of the flexibility. If you live in a city, you think that what you see around you is always like this, but it isn't. Of course, the city goes through an evolution. And it's a set of big innovations, big leaps in technology that have changed the functionality of our cities. The first one's like electricity. And we went from dark cities into enlightened cities, places where also at night life could go through. We had the car, which changed how we built our cities and where we built it. Not only in the city center, but we were able to build it up to 10, 15 miles to the outside. Then we had high-rise buildings. Today we build smart cities. It's much more about data and knowing where people are, how they influence the use of power, water, everything. And yeah, I think we are only at the beginning of a new era, and that's the era of blue cities, the cities where we start using the water. It's no longer necessary to build it at the location where you use it. You can prefab it, you can tow it and bring it to the city. So there's no construction time anymore in the city, and also no disturbance in the city anymore. So that's one thing. But second, it's also that through time you can start to move it. Think about seasonal cities. We think that the best floating cities and neighborhoods should open up in the summer, make more space on the water, have a lot of boats, and in the winter all the buildings move together, very compact, not that much distance to walk, and much more warmer.
The projects that are there now are quite expensive, and some people are worried that it will only be for the rich. I always use the example of a mobile phone. So in the mid-90s or the early 90s, you had the first people with a mobile phone. It was like this size. At that time, it was only for the rich, but the income that was generated with these first adopters was invested in this technology to make it much cheaper. And today, almost everyone in the world has a mobile phone.
The first floating student housing complexes are already available in Copenhagen.
This is as expensive as a 2 or 3 bedroom apartment in Copenhagen. But of course we only have the studio, right? So that is where the difference is coming from. It's just more convenient to run into people here. And I think also because from the start it's advertised as a space where you meet people. I was also not expecting it to be this cozy together.
You live on such a small area that you don't need that much energy for heating. And then you also share your things with neighbors, so...
It's probably where we spend the most time, our sofa. That's also where the most photos of us exist. I'm pretty sure that we are on a few postcards from Copenhagen already, because when people come with the boat, they see our beautiful houses and then they take photos.
You feel maybe sometimes a bit like in a zoo, but that's of course the disadvantages if you live in such an exotic place.
Now you also see a bit that the lamp is moving. There's been a few storms last autumn, then this is going crazy.
We also receive mails from the management that maybe it could be very shaky tonight. It's a bit exciting to see what's going on and feel the nature. It's like a thunderstorm, it's almost a bit cozy.
You feel the wind and the waves more on the rooftop than you do here. I think here it's always calm, so this is where you would go when you feel very seasick.
Urban Riga is, in its current state, it's a small neighborhood of 72 homes on a pier across the port of Copenhagen, where the neighborhood has been waiting for its urban master plan for decades. Politically, you have to find out what are we going to do. So very often you have pockets of time where for 10 or 20 or 30 years, no one is really doing anything permanent because they don't know exactly what's going to happen. So you could have a deplorable fleet of homes that could essentially move in, make an empty or underused place inhabitable for like a decade or two. And when the new master plan is approved, this fleet could then move to another place. So you constantly have this kind of nomadic neighborhood that will always find the next pocket in time that is underused and that can be animated and be brought to life.
So if you see these kind of floating developments, they're quite small. Even in the Netherlands we have small neighborhoods of 50 or 100 houses. But the future is, it has to grow. It has to grow to complete cities. And for us, the first city that has now been approved, and we started with the construction, is in the Maldives. The Maldives is a series of islands in the middle of the Indian Ocean, only 1.5 meters above sea level. So these are the first places that will be threatened by the sea level rise. And we see that in the center of that capital city, Male, where 250,000 people living on a location of 1 by 2 kilometers, there's no space. And they can't just expand the city. And in that place, I think these kind of floating cities, they make sense because you can build on the water, you have space enough, very safe for any extreme weather conditions. We have a community that's open for these kind of solutions because they have been living with water for decades and centuries. We've built the first Lego blocks there in the water. You can go there, you can see these float of houses on water. Now, from the first block, we have to build another, I think, 1,100 blocks to build the whole city.
3 model buildings have been constructed along the coast of Male. Viewings are already being held there. When the city is built, it's planned to accommodate up to 20,000 people.
Now, this is a typical 2-story house. We have a kitchen. As you can see, there is the living room here. And the living room, the good thing about this is the living room has access to the open sea. Usually in the Maldivian lagoons, the sea is calm. But still, this lagoon is 200 hectares, so the long waves have potential to come in. Now, when we place these islands here, these are placed calculated in specific locations, specific sizes. So it prevents the long waves to coming in. The platforms are interconnected together, and it is floating. So that means with the tide, it will go up and come down.
If you start building or even designing a master plan for a floating city, you have to be aware of what is where in the water. So first thing you do is you just kind of map every piece of coral in the location where you want to build. Then the next stage is that you're also going to see not how it can make sure there's no negative effect, but also how you can have a positive effect. So if you look about innovations you have to make a floating city work, the water creates other kinds of energy. So what we do for the floating city in the Maldives is we use the deep atoll water from 700 meters deep. We pump it up, it's very cold, like 5 to 7 degrees, and we use that to cool down the city and to use it for the air conditioning systems.
This city is designed to adapt to rising sea levels, but can it handle even more extreme conditions?
The question about floating city, if it's going to be safe or not, I've actually asked. That was the very first question I asked. What happens if a tsunami comes? I was there in the tsunami. We didn't realize anything was happening, because we were on a boat. The water line of Male was just like really high. And then suddenly we saw this, like the whole Male, it looked like a waterfall all around Male. As the tide was going out again, I knew there was something wrong. And then again, the next one came in, and then I can see the boats that was parked in the harbor. It was just like coming on top of on the roads.
When we start designing the kind of floating cities, what we do is we first take account of all the extreme weather conditions. We know what kind of tsunamis have hit these areas, but also about what kind of fluctuations we can expect in the next 100 years. How high will the water be in 100 years in the extreme conditions? And all that information is placed in a big model. And together with the engineers, we can then calculate how large our platforms will be, how fast they have to move up and down, what kind of mooring system we need for the whole city, not to flush and to move away. So it's much more than only architecture today.
The floating city in the Maldives is located in a relatively sheltered lagoon. Could floating cities also be feasible on the high seas under more extreme conditions? The Maritime Research Institute Netherlands is currently working on this question.
In here we can actually make a small-scale version of reality. So we can make wind and waves and current, and we make a small model of a floating city, and we make it in small, and then we can measure the behavior of that floating structure and what are all the motions and the loads due to the waves that come in. We tested for Mediterranean conditions until 6 meters wave height in this basin. In the Mediterranean, such an island could already be feasible. It is still very challenging to design a mooring system for such an island in the North Sea, because in the North Sea the waves are much higher than in the Mediterranean, maybe about twice as high, maybe 12 meters. For an offshore structure in high waves, we would make a high deck with as few water on the deck as possible. You can accept some water on the deck, but then you have to make sure that there's no people there and that the structures that you build on top are able to deal with the loads that are there due to the waves. If you have a 10-meter wave, then the wave structure itself will reflect the wave, so the wave will almost double. And then you need at least 20 meters above the sea to make sure that no water comes on the deck. We just did a first try in 2017 for a big, large floating island with all these connected triangles. If you have a series of connected triangles, the houses would be more to the back end of the island, where the motions are typically smaller in such an event. I do believe that if you are on the ocean in such a situation, that you need to think about what are the safety measures that you take. So maybe people should stay inside. In the worst case, you need maybe to evacuate some parts of the island as well. But this is much similar to maybe if there's a flooding risk right now.
While the construction of floating cities on the high seas is still in the testing phase, 3 floating islands have already been built in South Korea, on the Han River, which is notorious for its flooding. They feature technology that automatically stabilizes the buildings.
This is the biggest floating architecture on the water in the uses of the cultural and this kind of commercial activities. There are technologies for stabilizing these islands. There are lots of cables underneath to anchor those pontoons onto the bank of the Han River. And there are winches, up and down winches, electronic winches, controlled by the GPS system and the water leveling system.
The islands automatically correct their position when they're carried away by the current. During high tide in the monsoon season, the system keeps the islands level, above water.
In normal time, the variation of the islands is within 1 meter. It is very small, and in flood time, it can move within 10 meters, and high 10 meters. It is totally safe.
If the construction of safe and stable floating islands is technically feasible, isn't there a risk that urban expansion into the oceans will create new environmental problems?
Quand on regarde qui opère dans les océans,
if you look at who is active on the oceans, you will notice that it is often the same industrial players as on land. Many activities currently taking place at sea have catastrophic environmental consequences. Humanity now has the opportunity to use the sea as a source, as an engine of human development in the future, but in a sustainable and fair way. Otherwise, we're heading for disaster.
De façon durable et équitable. Sinon,
the idea of a floating city poses a tremendous challenge. Such a city would intrude on an existing ecosystem. If the marine ecosystem is covered by a floating city, which has to be anchored to the seabed, won't this result in changes to the marine substrate, the ecosystem, and perhaps the coral reefs? These floating islands will cause environmental pollution, and there are questions that need to be answered, depending on the technologies that are used or not used.
But how could such a city function without damaging the environment? What should be done with waste, for example? The proponents of the Blue Revolution have come up with solutions.
If we build the floating cities the same way as we build a city on land, we're not solving anything. We make the problem worse. I see it as a symbiosis between cities on land and water. How can they help each other? It's more that kind of process. It's not like, hey, we're escaping the land and we're all going to live on the ocean. But the cities on the land, they produce CO2, they produce nutrients by wastewater. And we all see that now as a waste, but for a city, On the water, a floating city, those could be resources.
In Rotterdam, a vacant swimming pool has been converted into a centre for startups looking to build a sustainable economy. It's called Blue City. Mariana Kuipers is researching the use of algae.
We developed a new material for the building sector. We call it seawood materials, and it's a series of wood-like board materials made from seaweed and agricultural waste streams or side streams. So it's mixed with the pigment, and then we transfer this into a specially designed mold, and then we press it. So this is then the seawood. It's a stiff material, but all made from natural fibers.
In Rotterdam, another way to reuse waste has been developed, a floating farm that produces food locally.
We feed our cows partly with residual products from the city. Next door we have a beer brewery, and they brew delicious beer, and what is left over is beer broth. So the cows, they love the beer broth. And finally also we have a bakery next door, and all the leftover from the bakery, it also goes to the cows. On the second floor, we make milk, yogurt, buttermilk, and also cheese. Countries like Singapore, Japan, Korea, they import a lot of food, over 90%, and they are surrounded by water. It would be great to create floating farms around countries so they could produce more locally, and we could reduce the food miles and then also reduce food losses. This is on a very small scale, but yeah, you have to test bedding, and that is what we do over here.
At the Rotterdam farm, food is produced on the water in the middle of the city. In Italy, a company is attempting to farm under the sea.
Nemo's Garden is the first ever underwater greenhouse experience for humanity. So basically we are growing plants underwater. We achieve it through a plastic dome, and this half sphere full with air is trapped underwater. So basically this is the surface, this surface here. Inside this air we have a lot of buildup of the humidity that naturally is generated by the evaporation of the sea. Because where does rain come from? We don't need to boil the sea to have evaporation. It's physics. It constantly happens, slowly, but it happens. And when the humidity is high enough, it rains because it condenses in clouds and precipitates. Inside the biosphere, it's kind of similar.
It's fresh. So it's drinkable. Yes. It's actually distilled. See, it's raining now. Yeah. And it has nutriment. We add the nutrients.
So we provide light thanks to the sun. Now we have fresh water for free, automatic. We have the pressure, which is boosting the growth of our plants, and we have stable temperature. The air cools off and warms up very rapidly, but water takes more time. And when it heats up, then it releases the warmth slowly. It's very important for plants to have stable temperature, so our greenhouse does not need heating and does not need air conditioning. We have tested vegetables and fruits of different kind, for example, strawberries, pumpkins. There's so many. We had a great success with beans. Soil is very precious and rare in the world, but we don't need soil because the seed is put on a substrate that is a holder. It can be of coconut fibers, a material that you can recycle from other biological waste. In the case of our plastic, which is methacrylate, it's a kind of material that does not release molecules in the water, and these domes are reusable for years. We understand that our product is going to be more expensive than something grown on land. Hopefully, this alternative will scale up to a moment where the price is not going to be that much more. If we find a way to create an alternative for agriculture which is sustainable, which uses resources in a responsible way, bingo, we have a solution or part of a solution.
Another major challenge facing humanity is the scarcity of drinking water. Is it possible to desalinate seawater on a large scale in an environmentally friendly way?
The idea came to me in Corsica. While taking a shower, I asked myself for the first time, where does the water actually come from? From there, I could see the big waves crashing against the coast. I thought to myself, you could combine the energy of the waves with the local resource, seawater, and turn it into a source of drinking water. A conventional desalination plant is a system that consumes electricity, which is mainly generated from fossil fuels. The electricity drives a high-pressure pump, which pumps the seawater through the membranes that act as salt filters and separate the seawater from the drinking water. The rest is returned to the sea as brine. Conventional brine is about twice to 1/2 times as salty as seawater. This raises the big question of how to ensure that this does not harm marine life. So, instead of using fossil fuels for energy, we have the mechanism at the water's surface and anchor it on the sea floor. The system actually works solely on wave motion, that is, through the movement of the buoy in the sea and the tension created by the connection between the buoy and the anchor, which generates the energy for the pump and the entire operation. The system is therefore purely mechanical, a bit like a bicycle pump. The brine produced in the process has a low concentration and is distributed far offshore where there are strong waves. It's mixed so well that the process is ecologically responsible.
The water is immediately potable, and each unit can supply some 5,000 litres per day. The first of these plants was deployed by a coastal city in Chile. But research is continuing because the cost of the water supplied by these plants is somewhat higher than conventional drinking water. Meanwhile, a company called Oceanics, in partnership with the United Nations, is preparing to build a floating city in Busan, South Korea.
One of the reasons we teamed up with Oceanics at their request and with the city of Busan was that we have seen really strong capacities in marine engineering, also a lot of economic capacities.
Both the United Nations and the city of Busan are supporting the project. But is the general population also prepared to welcome this development?
Humans have managed to fly to the moon and to space. That's now part of human history. That's why I believe we can take on this challenge, even at sea.
This floating city is interesting, yes, but it scares me. It wouldn't fit in, say, in a place like this beach.
I think there is this kind of inertia in architecture and urbanism. There's always some legislative body or some neighbor who has opinions that need to be taken into account. And similarly in Busan, the same is true. But I think each time people can visit a floating city, they can see how it complements the existing city and waterfront, then that often becomes like opening a door that others can walk through. When you're building a city on land, you have landscape features. You have the flow of a river and the riverbanks that you build along. You have the waterfront of the sea that you build down toward. And these landscape features also somehow inform the direction of the streets. So when you're building at the sea, you are potentially directionless. And therefore, we thought of this idea of the hexagon could be multi-directional. Those spaces can then contain water management, power storage, water filtration, and even in construction agriculture. It does sound a little science fiction-esque, but you know, one of the most beautiful cities on earth, Venice, it's built in the water on piles, originally for defensive purposes, and then it became an advantage that all the streets are paved with water. Like, let's just say, like, one of the most amazing cities we know of is entirely in the water. And in that sense, oceanics, the idea of floating cities could be like a 21st century equivalent of the marvel of human engineering and imagination that is Venice today. So the idea is to start with a floating prototype in Busan, inside a protected natural harbor. And for now, the purpose of oceanics is to develop an urban toolkit that can then be delivered at scale.
If floating cities could be built from toolkits, this could also pave the way for private cities located out on the open sea and beyond government control. This caters to those who dream of more autonomy than their governments give them.
Seasteading is a new utopian and libertarian project. It's all about taking the idea of living freely and taking it into deep water. And the ultimate goal is complete freedom. And of course that sounds quite attractive, but when one also thinks it's freedom for people who are wealthy, it's freedom for people who have a highly developed libertarian capitalist ideology, this isn't a vision for everybody, and it's not a vision for the masses, it's a vision that caters for the few. 200 nautical miles from any border, the nation state still has some power. But beyond that, we have the high seas. They knew that no state could get to them. You can, if you established a country on the high seas, be free from any police force, any military. You would have complete autonomy. And that is what the seasteaders want. They want the freedom to start their own society according to their own rules. Storms are particularly bad in the high seas. The height of waves can be tremendous. A structure wouldn't last very long before it was destroyed. So you really need to start thinking about bringing your free little republic into calmer waters. And that's why the seasteaders have been trying to develop relationships with all sorts of states, because they need that proximity to a state, and they need the calm, shallow waters in order for their structures to sustain themselves for more than a few months.
Calm waters. That's what the Seasteading Institute was looking for in the lagoons of French Polynesia in 2017. For the American group from Silicon Valley, it was the ideal place to build a floating settlement, far away from regulations and close enough for stability.
We were involved in the floating island for French Polynesia. Very interesting project, fully based on zero environmental impact, completely self-supporting systems. Yeah, very interesting. Unfortunately, that project was not realized because it was not supported enough by the local communities.
For its supporters, the project was a response to rising sea levels and an opportunity for economic growth. For opponents, however, it was a gateway for foreign investors to serve their own interests.
Look how peaceful it is here. And now they're ruining it with these floating islands. We have nothing left. Everything will be polluted afterwards. Every morning we come here to fish. We have our traditions. And now they're taking all that away from us? I can't believe it. We only heard that boats are no longer allowed to go out within a certain radius. They are not even subject to our labor laws. But who will work here? And who will still want to benefit from our beautiful lagoon? We would not even be allowed to sail our boats past the floating islands anymore. We in Tahiti live from fishing. Everyone here has their own boat and goes fishing, sometimes at night. And what could you catch there? There's the floating island, which disturbs everything.
For these American investors, all of whom are super rich billionaires, everything can be bought for them. A government, a mayor, a politician, simply everything. It was here, one there, and another one there. There were 3 zones. I had read about it in the press and seen that Monsieur Bouissou, the former vice president, had already signed his letter of intent. We saw photos of our mayor showing the Americans, the billionaires, around the entire lagoon. And that's when we realized that our government had already entered into partnerships with American investors from Silicon Valley who belong to a kind of sect and call themselves libertarians. No one ever listened to us. I myself was a member of the Polynesian Parliament at the time, and the government never discussed it with us. It wasn't a dream, it was a real nightmare. The idea of waking up in the morning and seeing a floating island in our lagoon? I don't know. We understand them. They want to go to beautiful places, but they also have to understand us. This is our home. I don't just come into your home and settle in saying, hey, make some room. No, it doesn't work like that. For us, it was a very colonialist approach.
Self-supporting, gated community out there on the oceans that has nothing to do with other people. That's not how I see it. So I see it more as a symbiotic relationship between the city on the water and the city on the land.
Always in human history, we have had those who have been bold and innovative. What may seem today as a utopia will probably become a reality in the next years.
It's more economic to build on land than it is to create a floating city. So a floating city is likely only to happen out of absolute necessity, unless somebody decides that as an experiment, it is worth that level of investment to demonstrate that potential.
I don't see a city in the future where we are completely on the open water with nothing else around us. I really see it always in combination of cities on land where we can expect these floating cities in the future. It's always be in the high density cities around the world. Shanghai, Tokyo, New York, Miami, everywhere where there's a threat of water, where the city is not that high, where there's a need of space. There I think it's logical that cities will grow over the water.
I'm convinced that in the coming century we will live much more on and under the sea. It's like a 6th continent, something to benefit all of humanity.